Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming, and I'm here with my co-host, friend, and colleague, Mr. Tim O'Toole, on a slightly somber note here this Friday, June 5th, after what's been going on. But how's it going, Tim?
It's going okay, Brian. A lot going on in Washington right now.
A lot going on. That is the understatement of the decade, I think, so far from Mr. O'Toole. But yeah, but thank you.
I try to be very, very understated.
Try to be understated and measured. Those are the watchwords that we go with here on this program. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. We're recording this again Friday, June 5. This will be posted at the normal time next week on Tuesday, the 9th. Thanks to everybody especially who's listened to the past couple of episodes, the China extravaganza and the Huawei episodes. We've gotten a lot of good feedback. Not surprisingly, I think we're going to continue to do a lot of China content today and going forward. And so before we do get started, just the normal disclaimers. We're not here giving legal advice. We're not using or discussing any confidential information. And if you do enjoy the pod, we certainly encourage everybody to subscribe, to give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating, and to check us out wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Google, Stitcher, Spotify. Watch us on YouTube so you can make fun of the fact that Tim and I may never get a haircut again while the pandemic is in effect. Yeah, we really, again, appreciate all the feedback and support that we're getting from everybody out there. Yeah, so I think here's the quick roadmap for today, and then we're actually going to do a little prelude before we get into the meat of the episode. So we are going to start, not surprisingly, with Hong Kong and the big announcements that have come out of the U.S. with respect to Hong Kong and some changes coming there. And more broadly, the prospect of significant sanctions on China that could be coming down the road. We're then going to go revisit topic number 1 from last time, Huawei, and a couple of new developments there that we want to touch on. And then the last big item we're going to hit is a massive indictment that just was unsealed last week relating to a huge sanctions evasion and money laundering scheme out of North Korea. And that'll wrap up sort of the main portion of the program. And then the lightning round, we're going to hit Venezuela, Iran again, and wrap up with some curious goings on with respect to the BIS entity list. And that'll be our show today. Before we do that, though, as I indicated, we do have a little prelude. And that relates, not surprisingly, to the news that has been dominating the headlines here in the U.S. and really around the globe for the last couple weeks, which is the protests that have been sparked by the killing of George Floyd while in police custody in Minneapolis on May 25th. Tim and I had a very brief discussion, because we were of the same mind here, whether or not we should sort of directly discuss this on the show, but I think it was abundantly clear to both of us that we really had to, for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, as you're going to hear in just a few moments, when we get to the Hong Kong portion of the show, the U.S. measures taken with respect to Hong Kong are in reaction to a new law that has been passed in Beijing, and the perceived lack of autonomy in Hong Kong in the cracking down on protesters and human rights violations that have been seen in conjunction with that. And not surprisingly, China has responded to the protests here in the U.S. by using that as a talking point to sort of undercut the moral authority and legitimacy of the U.S. actions that are being taken toward Hong Kong. So whether we like it or not, we were going to be talking about this anyway. Secondly, in recent days, there has been some rumblings out of the UK, obviously one of the closest US allies, that exports of riot gear and other types of police equipment, law enforcement equipment, should be suspended or severely restricted to the US in light of the response to the protests that have been going on here. So again, these things are inextricably linked. Our podcast is about current events. It's about policies. It's about politics. It's about all of those things as they relate to the world of international trade. And so I think there is no escaping this, as there's no escaping this for any of us right now. Beyond that, though, on a sort of more direct level, our offices in downtown DC are a block away from Lafayette Park and the White House, which is where much of the action in DC has been focused, where the tear gassing of the protesters occurred the other night. And so again, we felt a responsibility to at least acknowledge that and to talk about it in some form or fashion as responsible members of the legal community and as criminal defense lawyers who know the justice system and many of the inequities that exist there. We did feel a need to address this at the outset. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Tim to add a few comments before we get into the meat of the show.
Thanks, Brian. And we did talk yesterday and just decided that we couldn't be silent about what's happening. I know that we both want to be very careful because we are treading outside of our comfort zone. And I think, I want to be very clear up front. We live in a great country, but the story of our country is that tomorrow is always better than yesterday. Things get better. There's a progression. We started as a country that enshrined slavery in the Constitution. We fought a war to end that, but then we enshrined white supremacy into law for 100 years. And then we had a civil rights struggle that eliminated the legal framework for white supremacy, but the problem continued, and the events of the past few days indicate and make very clear that racism still is a fundamental American problem, especially when it comes to the police. It's a problem that has very deep roots. The police were used before the Civil War to find fugitive slaves. After the Civil War, they were a primary tool to enforce the legal framework of white supremacy. They even looked the other way when there was a horrible problem of lynching in the United States that had gotten so bad that the federal government thought about passing anti-lynching laws, although at the time those laws had a tough time getting through the Senate. So while the problem has gotten better over time, we have never really dealt with it, and we've never rooted it out. And it's a deep-seated, long-standing problem that we've chosen not to address. And let's make clear, it's a choice. The killing of George Floyd, the horrible killing of George Floyd, is a symptom of that problem, but it's not the only symptom of that problem. There's a steady drumbeat of killings by the police that haven't been addressed, and by vigilantes. Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Ahmaud Arbery. It's not one, and it's a pattern, and it's something that I've seen. I was a public defender for many years, and I've seen it many times in my responsibilities as a public defender. I'll give you just a couple of examples. In one of the first cases that I had when I was a young public defender, I represented a young man, an African-American man from Camden, New Jersey, named Thomas Nevius. And at Thomas's trial, he was accused of a terrible crime involving a white victim. And before the trial, the prosecutor struck all the African-Americans from the jury and then bragged about it to defense counsel afterwards. Actually said, didn't think I wanted any of those people, and that was not the word that he used, on the jury. While we ultimately overturned Tommy's death sentence, we were never able to get a court to actually deal with that issue, even though it was undisputed. And in fact, we wound up getting an affidavit from the training person in the Clark County DA's office at the time, who verified that was a practice of that office whenever they had a case involving a black defendant and a white victim. And so I saw that very early in my career. I dealt with it recently in the Evangelista Ramos case, where our firm and I worked with Sarah Dowd, who you and I both have worked with quite a bit, Brian, in addressing the issue of non-unanimous jury verdicts in Louisiana. And part of our brief talked about how that practice had arisen from the Jim Crow era, where the Jim Crow Congress in Louisiana in around the turn of the 20th century got together and figured out laws that could be used to keep African Americans from using any of the civil rights that they gained after the Civil War. And one of the things that they chose to do was to allow non-unanimous jury verdicts. And we documented that history for the Supreme Court. We've actually spent about the last 10 years we filed multiple briefs in cases before the Supreme Court granted cert. And ultimately, some of that history wound up in the Supreme Court opinion in which the Supreme Court recently struck down the non-unanimous jury practice as violative of the Sixth Amendment. So we've seen it in our careers. I've seen it as my career as a PD. We've seen it, at Miller and Chevalier, and I think, this sort of practice, when allowed to fester, creates this expectation of immunity, an expectation that there's a message to the police from all of society that some lives just don't matter, that you can cast them away. And if you watch the video of George Floyd, I mean, it is 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which, when you do a pause, if you stand for 30 seconds, that's long, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And you can watch from that video and see that there's just no expectation that there will ever be any consequences. And it sends the message that these lives just don't matter, that they can be cast away like they're nothing. And obviously, that's wrong, and it's gone on too long, and it's created all this anger, and the anger that you talked about, Brian, that we've seen in terms of the protests that are right outside our office, and we haven't done anything to change it, or at least we haven't done enough to change it. And I think that, to the extent that people think that it's not our problem and that it doesn't affect us, it is our problem. And I think that that's something that it's on us if we don't change it, because we have the means to change it. We live in a democracy, and a democracy values peaceable assembly. It values petitioning your government, and we do have the power to make change. Now, that is the right of protest is something that, as you pointed out, Brian, we've recognized in our trade rules. That is that our trade rules say if a dictatorship, if an authoritarian regime takes actions to crack down on protests, we won't send them certain goods. We will not. There is an entire export control category that is labeled as it's crowd control. We won't send crowd control equipment to authoritarian regimes because we're worried that they will use it on their own people. And that's wrong. And I think we as Americans have taken the position that it's wrong, but now we have other countries coming to us and telling us that they're not going to send us crowd control equipment because of the events that we saw happen in Lafayette Park last week. And I think that is something that we need to have a reckoning with. And I think it's a time to think about all these issues, a time to really reflect on what we can do about these issues. And unfortunately, it's a time when we need to figure out how we can change things for the better, because after 150 years after the Civil War, it really is time to start fixing things.
Well said. We'll leave it there for now, and now return you to our regularly scheduled program. But as Tim said, something that we're all thinking about now, and certainly will be thinking and working on for the foreseeable future. So with that, let's get into the main part of the episode today, which, as I said at the outset, is Hong Kong and the big announcement with respect to Hong Kong. So we started discussing this, or this was starting to fester when we recorded the last episode, which came just on the heels of the announcement that there was going to be a security law passed in Beijing that was going to further compromise the autonomy of Hong Kong and its people. And the rumblings started immediately in the U.S. government that there was going to be some actions being taken to reckon with that. And so, sure enough, that came to pass. Soon thereafter, the State Department issued a report to Congress pursuant to the Hong Kong, the recently amended Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act from last year, that essentially certified that Hong Kong was no longer autonomous from China. And thereafter, the president announced there was going to be a big announcement late last week. So that announcement came a week ago on May 30th. And it was heavy on rhetoric, light on details. But I think we're going to get into in a moment, sort of parsing what was said and what's been promised and what that really means. So it was in many ways kind of an airing of grievances with China generally. There was complaints about the World Health Organization, the COVID response, IP theft, many of the things that we hear the president and the government generally accusing China of and complaining about with respect to China. But at the end of the day, the real pointed portion of the statements and what everybody has kind of latched onto is the promise now that that Hong Kong's special status vis-a-vis the U.S. as a trade partner and otherwise is going away by virtue of the new law that was passed by the Chinese government and the resulting now lack of autonomy in Hong Kong in the eyes of the U.S. And so, what does that mean? Well, in broad strokes, that means that sort of customs preferences and duties and things of that sort are likely going away. Visa treatment special visa treatment going away for travel purposes, both in and out. And in our world, export control rules will be changing, and the promise of sanctions, additional sanctions. Now, I think at a broad level, we presume that essentially Hong Kong is now going to be treated just like China with respect to export controls and customs and things like that. And we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of episodes, obviously, talking about some of the the recent sort of harsher restrictions that the U.S. has been imposing on China with respect to all those measures. On the sanctions front, we started last time to discuss what that might look like with respect to China. And one thing we didn't talk about too much the last time is that the law that was passed last year, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which was just enacted in November, that has a sanctions component to it. At the time, the president sort of signaled that he wasn't really planning to deploy that. And it is pretty narrow. It is really about going after Chinese officials or Hong Kong officials who are part of the rendition, arrest, extradition, or of Hong Kong, demonstrators and protesters or people who are involved in gross human rights violations. So it's pretty narrow. The stick that we think is coming that we talked about last time is that if there are new sanctions that are imposed via an executive order or even congressionally, that the financial institutions and the financial infrastructure of Hong Kong, which is so central to Hong Kong's identity, will now be in the crosshairs and will be implicated and will be tied into whatever measures are going to be imposed. So at present, we don't know, again, what that's going to look like. This is still too early because we're a week out from the announcement. We have no further detail. But I think, let me throw it to you, Tim, especially on the sanctions front, sort of what do you take from the president's statements? What do we think? What do we expect on the sanctions front? What do we expect on the export controls front, and more broadly? And do we have any sense, do you have any feel for what kind of timetable we're talking about on any of this? Because this has obviously put a lot of people on edge on opposite sides of the globe and or really all over the globe, with Hong Kong as a financial hub. So what do we make of all this, and what do we think could be coming next?
So there's a lot in play, I think, because the combination of the 1992 law and the 2019 law and the Secretary of State's certification that Hong Kong is now not sufficiently autonomous from China add up to the possibility that Hong Kong will start to be treated exactly like China for all sorts of purposes, export control purposes. Sanctions could be imposed against Hong Kong leaders who go along with these Chinese security laws and security measures. So there really is the possibility, all the way from kind of these limited targeted sanctions against Chinese officials or potentially some Hong Kong officials, all the way up to a complete changing of the tariffs and essentially taking the trade war against China to the turning it into also a trade war against Hong Kong, which would be a huge expansion because of Hong Kong's importance in all sorts of trade issues. It's really hard to tell what's going to happen out of that, because all we have is kind of this bare bones certification from the Secretary of State and some statements from the president that are vague about what could be done. And I do think that you have to view this as part of the what we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 episodes, which is there is an overall dispute with China. This administration has decided that China is going to be their focus, at least internationally, for the next 6 months, and so this is part of it. I do think that that in terms of the timing, on the one hand, I think that the Chinese have forced the issue by taking the security law that was originally put in front of Hong Kong's legislature, Hong Kong's ruling body, and taking it to the Chinese legislature and passing it at a time, I think, that they were hoping that there would be little notice. So I think that China has forced the issue by essentially escalating the issue of Hong Kong's autonomy to a relatively urgent issue. On the other hand, I think that their timing in some sense was intentional because they thought that the president might be distracted by other events that are going on here. On the other hand, I mean, their timing is actually pretty good given what's going on here, because in the current circumstances, it becomes a lot harder for the U.S. to complain about China cracking down on a semi-autonomous area like Hong Kong using the Chinese military when the U.S. is turning the U.S. military in a semi-autonomous region like the District of Columbia against its own people here.
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, the Chinese sort of state media outlets are gleefully reporting on what's going on in the U.S. and are, calling us the biggest us, the big royal us, the biggest hypocrites going as a result. So that may resonate with some, not with others, but that is sort of where we find things at the moment. Another related point is, and an interesting one is, I've seen a lot of sort of think pieces and other commentary on this, and curious to hear your thoughts. There's obviously in much the same way that in the Huawei restrictions and some of the other military and user restrictions, the things we've been talking about now for the past several months, but really especially the past month, that there's a school of thought that at the end of the day, this is going to hurt U.S. interests as much, if not more, than it's going to hurt China's interests. And are we sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face here? The same, I think, thinking prevails here, which is, are we just going to be harming Hong Kong, which is a bit of and all of the companies and individuals that have taken root in Hong Kong and found it to be sort of their foothold in Asia and to conduct their operations? Are we going to be doing unnecessary damage to them at the expense for what may end up being very little deterrence or ultimate impact on Beijing? Is this going to cause some kind of a flight out of Hong Kong and for others to find other locales? And I know we have some thoughts on where they may go. And I saw Boris Johnson make a statement the other day that he's welcoming people back to the UK if they want to leave Hong Kong under whether it's the new security law or the fallout from new sanctions or other restrictions the US imposes or whatever the case may be. So what do we think? What do we make of that? Because I think those ripple effects are going to be are a little hard to discern right now, and are also going to ultimately, I think, be telling in terms of how much follow through there's going to be on this from the U.S. side.
Right. I mean, I think that from the U.S. side, there's kind of a very tight rope to walk, because on the one hand, I do think that what China has done over the last 6 months with respect to Hong Kong has really weakened Hong Kong's position in the international finance community. And we've talked about this quite a bit offline. Hong Kong is a huge financial center, but there are other financial centers in that part of the world, like Singapore, that are not potentially going to be controlled by China in the same way that Hong Kong seems to be starting to be controlled by Hong Kong. And I think that that could prompt, that could really hurt Hong Kong in the short, medium, and long run in terms of its ability to be the sort of trading hub that it's been for hundreds of years now. So our goal is the United States, I think, our stated goal is to make things better for Hong Kong, to help Hong Kong in this. And so, by pushing back against the security law, then maybe we do help Hong Kong, because if it maintains its autonomy, that I think would be the best result in the long run for Hong Kong. But if it's not going to maintain its autonomy anyway, or if we essentially help the Chinese by turning Hong Kong into China. So we essentially take what they've done with a security law and strip away one aspect of Hong Kong's autonomy and basically say, okay, fine, the autonomy's gone, we're going to treat you as the same. I think that probably will hasten the problem that's happening to Hong Kong, because if the United States and other Western countries start treating Hong Kong as part of China, in some sense that plays right into China's hand and probably speeds up the phenomenon. Now, I'm not sure what beyond that we can really do about it. And so I take the point that I'm sure would be kind of thrown back at me from people who are proponents of these sorts of laws, that you have to do something. But I think that this something, unless it's really carefully thought out, could make things worse and not better.
Yeah, I think the sort of we say this a lot, but I think it's particularly true here. The devil's going to be in the details to some degree, as the sanctions, whatever sanctions may be coming, and the signals have been that it's going to be pretty narrow. It doesn't sound like there's going to be some sweeping, massive sanctions effort or program that's going to be stood up to deal with this. It sounds like it's going to be pretty narrow, but we don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know how it's going to be deployed. Like the original, like the Hong Kong bill from last year, there was a 180-day reporting requirement that was supposed to identify who the officials were that were responsible for these human rights violations. That deadline, I believe, just came like 2 weeks ago, and there's no report. And so there's nobody that's been sanctioned, and that's not surprising with respect to the last bill. But it's sort of, there can be what kind of actions actually going to be taken here, and sort of how much that may incite the Chinese to retaliate or take additional measures. Would that cause them to walk away from the trade deal? Would that was obviously a big concern originally, that whatever was going to be passed with respect to Hong Kong last year could sully the trade deal. But now with phase one of the trade deal kind of on wobbly legs anyway, and with phase two sort of nowhere in sight, it's hard to know whether those things are still going to be drivers, or whether that's even leverage if China says they'll walk away. It's hard to forecast. I would, on a related note, and to pivot slightly, also just recently there was another, with respect to China and sanctions, there was another bill that was just passed that has not yet made its way to the president's desk, which is the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which seeks to impose sanctions on, again, certain Chinese officials and others who are involved in the camps and the other sort of repressive tactics that are being used against the Uyghurs and other Muslim and ethnic minorities in China. And this passed near unanimously through the House. The Senate version passed, and this too has a pretty narrowly focused sanctions component to it, which again requires an 180-day report identifying who the people are that are responsible for this treatment, and provides for blocking and other measures to be taken against them, sort of traditional sanctions measures. So what do you make of that? Do we think that is this something the president will sort of sign with vigor, or is it going to linger? Or, I mean, it's a veto-proof bill because of the majorities it passed with in both houses. So presumably it is going to get signed at some point. But what do you make of that? And does that change the calculus at all with respect to the bigger picture with U.S. and China sanctions sort of at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the president will sign it. I think the president will probably say something about China that is kind of another small poke in the eye to China about this issue. I doubt that this is going to be a big sanctions program. I think it'll probably be more along the lines of some of the Nord Stream 2 sanctions that we've seen over the course of time that have kind of just bubbled up. Congress has passed them, the president signed them, and then we never hear about Nord Stream 2 again until a few years later or a few months later when Congress says we need more sanctions about Nord Stream 2. I think the Uyghur bill will likely be like that. There's a few people that'll be sanctioned, but I don't think it's going to be amount to much of anything.
Yeah, so one final thought on this, and then we should probably move on. But as we discussed the last time, the president and OFAC are perfectly capable right now of sanctioning whomever they want relating to Hong Kong or the Uyghurs under the Global Magnitsky Act for human rights violations.
Exactly.
Period, full stop. They could add whomever they want to the SDN list on that basis alone if they wanted to, which strongly suggests to us that this is in some ways largely a symbolic measure that is not necessarily going to have the teeth that some would like to see it have. I think, and we will come to this later on when we talk a bit more about the big North Korea related indictment that was unsealed recently, if they were ever going to give this some real teeth, they would have to go after the banks. They would have to go after the Chinese banks who are behind many of the activities that the US cites as being the most troubling and concerning. And there has so far been a resistance to do that because presumably they are worried about the repercussions and the ripple effects there in terms of what China would do, or what kind of tension that would create to the diplomatic relationship such as it is at the moment, which is not very good. But so some of this, I don't want to go so far as to say that these bills are just total window dressing, but unless there's something with some real teeth that's going to be implemented with some real vigor that goes after some of those actors, I don't think that the needle's really going to be moved all that much on the sanctions front with respect to China.
Yeah, fully agree. And just to be clear, when I talked about the president poking China's eye with respect to the Uyghurs, that shouldn't diminish the problem that is going on in China with respect to the Uyghurs. I mean, it's a terrible problem. I just think that these sanctions, as they're written, aren't going to amount to much because, as you point out, Brian, the authority already exists to impose these sorts of sanctions. So we could impose them now if we wanted to, even before Congress passes a law. But I think to your other point, that is the broadening these sanctions to financial institutions. I mean, that really is, I think, a huge part of the dynamic as to what's going on. If we really want to get into a sanctions war with China, it would be unlike any other sanctions program or policy we've ever had before. A big sanctions program against China could have huge repercussions and could wind up in unpredictable places and could be really problematic for the world economy. And so I think the U.S. is, and in my view, rightly shying away from that. But it's really hard to both shy away from real sanctions while at the same time looking tough on sanctions, because if you're really gonna go after the Chinese government for these practices, you're gonna have to do a lot more than this.
Yeah, we'll see if we hit the tipping point on that. It's never out of the question that we could, but for now, it doesn't seem that we have. So let's leave that for now, and let's move on to another one of our favorite topics, which is Huawei, and specifically two threads of Huawei discussion, which are stockpiling and extradition.
All right. Well, so we're still on China because we really haven't seemed able to leave that in the last two episodes, but that's because we talk about the things that are biggest in the trade law area, and China is just by far the biggest space right now in the trade law area. And Huawei, I think, is the biggest target of U.S. trade sanctions against China, and that really has turned into something relatively big, although what the U.S. has seen with respect to Huawei, and we've talked about it frequently on this podcast, is that Huawei seems very creative in the ways that it is able to essentially outrun whatever new sanctions measure that the U.S. has decided to impose upon it. And so after it went on the entity list, there were problems that the U.S. thought with Huawei being able to get certain types of U.S. technology, either using the de minimis rule or the foreign direct product rule. The U.S. decided that it had ways around those, and recently, originally proposed measures that would limit the ability of Huawei as an entity list entity to acquire products that were contained over 10% U.S. technology. Now that measure ultimately failed, as I understand it, and so 25% is still the rule with Huawei. But recently, the U.S. changed the rules with respect to the foreign direct product rule, made more U.S. technology subject to the foreign direct product rule in a way that was clearly, I mean, obviously and really quite unusually targeted Huawei, its subsidiaries, and really no one else. He created a whole new footnote regime in the entity list related to the foreign direct product rule. So what happens? Well, recently we read reports that Huawei has stockpiled 2 years worth of semiconductors, the same semiconductors that these changes to the foreign direct product rule were aimed at. And so presumably Huawei, these rules won't affect Huawei for 2 years. And in the meantime, I feel certain that Huawei is trying to reconfigure its supply lines so that it doesn't need any US technology in those supply lines. We'll see whether it's successful in that. But I think that is kind of the shot fired back from the Huawei side, and we'll see. I think we can probably look forward in future episodes to talking about what the U.S. government is going to do in response to Huawei's stockpiling of apparently years and years worth of semiconductors.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick comments on that. So the report, and apparently this is coming straight from Huawei, is that Huawei spent over $23 billion stockpiling chips and other materials just last year, which is a massive uptick from the prior year, not surprisingly. And that essentially the reporting on this is that this effort began when Huawei's CFO, who we're going to talk about in just a moment, was arrested in late 2018 because they sort of saw the writing on the wall that that harsher measures, more restrictions were coming from the US. And so they implemented this plan to sort of stockpile. So that's interesting, number one. Number two, whenever you're talking in this space and in this universe, telecom, high tech, semiconductors, and in particular, we're not just, for those who know the difference, we're talking about CPUs, we're talking about field programmable gate arrays, we're talking about other types of technology like that. Whenever you're talking about holding those types of materials for any length of time, they typically become obsolete very quickly. So you're going to be generations behind before you can say, boo. And on top of that, the other issue that they're going to face, which this was touched on a little bit in the reporting, and this is something that we've seen in our own experience, is that if they're stockpiling essentially off the shelf semiconductors, the customization that they need for their own hardware and their own systems is not going to be as readily available, because that's the whole point of having cut them off from the foundries and from their own proprietary designed chips, is that that goes out the window, and now they're potentially stuck with things that are not quite to spec or to their own to meet their own needs. And so what happens there is, what's a viable alternative? It seems the most likely viable alternative would be that their own chip producer, HiSilicon, would be the ones to try to ramp up here, but they are caught by the new rules as well. So they are sort of hamstrung equally. And reports again are that they are, in any event, some years behind being able to produce at a level that some of these foundries who are now no longer going to be able to produce Huawei chips can produce. So that's just and on top of that, one last thought: never underestimate maybe this is exactly what the US government knew was going to happen, and they're happy to hear this happen, and they say, well, great, now Huawei's tech is going to be, or their chip capabilities are kind of frozen in time, frozen in amber as a result of this, so that's fine, we can live with that. I also wouldn't be surprised if they hear this and see this and are maybe weren't anticipating it, and then make some further modification to somehow try to undercut this maneuver, because it seems that they're trying to whatever moves are being made by Huawei, there is a mirror image response, or at least an attempted mirror image response from BIS and the U.S. government at some point down the road. So I don't know what that will be. I don't know, again, whether this is played exactly into their hands or whether this is something that's going to come as a bit of a surprise. But stay tuned for more on this, because I'm sure that we will be coming back to this again.
It's a cat and mouse game, but it's
Yeah.
not clear who's the cat and who's the mouse.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I think the mouse, the very well-off mouse who is living in a rented mansion outside of, or no, I'm sorry, not a rented mansion, in one of her family's mansions outside of Vancouver, is Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. And there was a court ruling in Canada that came down that Tim's going to cover next, which I think we have a couple of thoughts on as well.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty interesting court ruling, and I think it's probably the first of at least a few court rulings. As folks will remember, Meng Wanzhou is or I think she still is the CFO of Huawei. She's the daughter of the founder of Huawei, and about a year ago, she was changing planes in Vancouver when she was arrested on a U.S. arrest warrant and request for extradition. So she was arrested by Canadian authorities, and she's been held, as you pointed out, Brian, in her family's house near Vancouver for the last year, awaiting extradition proceedings. And the first aspect of her extradition proceeding was completed last week with the decision from the Canadian judge upholding the request from a dual criminality standpoint. And so we've talked on the program before about the extradition standard of dual criminality, and that basically means that in order to have an extraditing company or country extradite someone back to your country, whatever law you're proceeding under, and here it's the US, whatever US law you're proceeding under, has to also, Canada has to make the same sort of conduct illegal. And so the trick here is that the underlying kind of cause of Meng Wanzhou's detention is that she was being investigated for violations, or Huawei was being investigated for violations of the US sanctions against Iran. And Canada does not have any sanctions against Iran. So trade with Iran is completely legal under Canadian law, but it's obviously illegal under US law. And so that was kind of the sticking point and the premise for Meng Wanzhou's argument that there was no dual criminality. Now, the problem with that argument was that Meng Wanzhou has also been charged with bank fraud, and the bank fraud arose allegedly when she was in a restaurant in Hong Kong, and she was meeting with HSBC representatives, and she was trying to explain to them that there was really no improper link between Huawei and a company called Skytech in Iran that apparently Meng Wanzhou had previously been on the board of directors of. Now, she'd left the board of directors, but Huawei maintained apparently some sort of, this is the government's theory, maintained control over Skytech at the time that Meng Wanzhou was saying that there was no relationship between Huawei and Skytech. And so at least allegedly, those statements about the lack of relationship were critical in helping Huawei obtain funding from HSBC. And so that's the bank fraud charge. And under Canada law, Canada has bank fraud laws, and you can't make a false statement in order to get money from a bank. And I think those laws are pretty universal. And so the US was arguing, well, this is clear dual criminality. This is a bank fraud charge, and Canada has bank fraud laws, and the US has bank fraud laws. So what the conduct she is charged with is illegal in Canada, and so we can extradite her to the U.S. to face the same charges here. Now, the gray area is that, and this is what Meng Wanzhou's lawyers argued, was that, well, but the bank fraud charge is inextricably tied up with the U.S. sanctions against Iran. And so the only reason that these statements were material at all was because the bank was concerned with violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. And so when the underlying charge, even though it might be on its face a crime in both countries, where the underlying charge is tied up with something so closely that is a crime in one country but not a crime in the other, you shouldn't find dual criminality. And there, as I understand it, in the opinion, the court discusses an old Canadian precedent under the Fugitive Slave Act, where someone who was being pursued by the U.S. under the Fugitive Slave Act, kind of harkening back to what we talked about before, Canada viewed that as a law. Not only did Canada not have slavery, but Canada viewed that law as a law that it would not enforce. And so even though the U.S. government was arguing in that case that the extradition was proper because Canada has fugitive laws, Canada decided that the fugitive charges were so inextricably tied up with a law that they didn't recognize and wouldn't enforce that the extradition couldn't go forward. And so Meng Wanzhou was relying on that precedent to support her argument that the bank fraud charges were too tied up with the sanctions. The court rejected that, but it did note that this was an open question, that it was a tough area of law. The court rejected the argument under the theory that the Fugitive Slave Act was so much more onerous under Canadian law and so much more essentially disapproved of under Canadian law than the U.S. sanctions against Iran, that you couldn't equate the two cases. But it was an issue that I think even the court admitted was a pretty close call. And I suspect that we may not have heard the last of this issue in the extradition proceedings.
Yeah, I think I think the idea that sort of fraud is fraud is kind of fundamental to the approach that the U.S. takes to extradition from friendly countries where we have extradition treaties in sort of this space, in this sort of sanctions, export control, even many other white collar crime space, and the comments from the judge essentially acknowledge that and essentially say, look, I'm not going to even though there are differences between domestic U.S. law and Canadian law with respect to sanctions, at the end of the day, fraud is fraud, and it is legitimate to pursue a fraud charge essentially against an individual or an entity that through their fraudulent statements may have induced a bank to violate these sanctions, right? That was essentially the analysis that she came down with. But I agree with Tim that we've not heard the last of this, and it's this is a flavor of this argument gets presented in just about every extradition proceeding that really gets contested anywhere in the world when U.S. sanctions are somehow involved, and we're seeking extradition of somebody to be sent back to the U.S. So this is not really novel. Canada is, and as many would suspect, is generally going to be more amenable to extradition requests from the U.S. that are coming in this vein. This is obviously so high profile, and this particular defendant has such, essentially endless resources that this is likely to drag on for a few more years. My understanding is that there's going to be sort of a Fourth Amendment style hearing to deal with whether the search of her and her phone at the airport was legal. There's going to be potentially an appeal of this ruling, as Tim alluded to. There's potentially going to be another preliminary hearing that's going to look at sort of sufficiency of the evidence. There's going to be a number of steps before we ever get to whether there's a go, no go on the extradition. And then my understanding is even after the court rules on that there's somebody in the sort of Canadian executive branch, essentially the Minister of Justice, has to sort of greenlight that to finally go through. So we haven't heard the last of this. This is and also in the background, keep in mind that her very presence in Canada is a major tension point between China and Canada. There are Canadian citizens currently being held in China that are largely viewed as being held for retaliatory purposes. And of course, with the deteriorating relationship between the US and China, this just kind of makes all of this all the more complicated. So there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of question marks, I think, as we go forward. It's not surprising that this hurdle was overcome from keeping things on track toward potentially an extradition, because it would have, quite frankly, been shocking if the judge had ruled otherwise, in my view. But there are many other hurdles to get over here, and so we'll have to see. But But yeah, the gray area Tim identified is an interesting one, and will be interesting to see if there's further parsing of this at the appellate level in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, as you said, Brian, there are also a couple more steps left. As I understand it, Canada's extradition laws require, in terms of whether there's sufficient evidence to extradite, require a consideration only of the quote admissible evidence. And so, as I understand it, there's going to be a hearing about one key piece of evidence. I think Mrs. Meng's cell phone was confiscated and then searched after she was arrested. So there's
Yep.
going to be a hearing about whether that was allowable under Canada law, and that will determine whether or not that evidence is quote admissible under the terms of the extradition statute. And then, if assuming it, whether it is or it isn't, the court will then go to the question, I think, of whether or not there's sufficient evidence to extradite. And so, it's definitely, there definitely is going to be more. There definitely is. This is going to take a while.
And from seeing some Canadian legal experts kind of weigh in on this, they are forecasting this could still be years in the making. And so God willing, if Tim and I are still here doing the podcast in 2023 or something, maybe we'll finally have resolution on this. But it could be a while.
Yeah.
So with that, let's pivot to our last big topic, which is the big indictment that was unsealed in the District of Columbia last week, relating to a massive sanctions evasion and money laundering scheme having to do with the Foreign Trade Bank of North Korea. And to very briefly summarize this for anybody who hasn't seen it, essentially the Foreign Trade Bank of North Korea was put on the SDN list back in 2013 for its role in North Korea's ballistic missile and nuclear programs. And essentially the indictment alleges that right after that, or shortly thereafter, a massive effort started up, originating in the North Korean government, the top officials at the Foreign Trade Bank, and then a number of other confederates, to basically stand up all around the world literally hundreds of front companies that would allow the Foreign Trade Bank and the North Korean government to still have access to the US financial system. And this was done in China and in Russia and in Europe and in the Middle East and in literally all around the world. And so in some ways, this and to the tune of over $2 billion worth of transactions that were allegedly routed through these front companies that touched on U.S. correspondent banks that would have been violative of the North Korea sanctions. And in conjunction with this, there's also a big civil forfeiture piece to this of over $60 million that have been frozen in various accounts that are linked to this alleged conspiracy. So a couple of quick thoughts on this, and then I'll hand it over to Tim. So number one, we just talked a few episodes ago about the big UN report that detailed many of these same types of practices coming out of North Korea in terms of sanctions evasion, money laundering, et cetera, and how those continue and have in some ways perhaps even grown over the past few years. And then there was the similar or simultaneously, essentially, there was a report from the US government on malicious cyber activity of the North Koreans, and many of the sanctions evasion tactics were detailed in there as well. So this is not, in some ways, not new news, but at the same time, I think the scope and breadth of this is pretty interesting to note. That's number one. Number two, the indictment itself is essentially just a laundry list of transactions that occurred over the course of the last 6 or 7 years relating to the front companies, many Chinese companies, many Chinese banks that are most of whom are unnamed, or there's Chinese Bank 1, 2, 3, and 4, which I'll come back to in a moment. And so in some ways, this is also a bit of a sort of a, for your compliance toolkit out there, anybody at banks or on the US side of this, because there is some allegation that some of this was used not to just get US dollars, but also to obtain goods from the U.S. Is something to keep in mind and to bear in mind and to sort of review for those purposes. The third piece is exactly what I just alluded to about the role of China in all of this. So, so a couple of thoughts on that. So this indictment was returned earlier this year. It came back in February, and it was just unsealed last week. Which the timing of that is a bit curious because there was clearly no intention or thought that they were going to arrest anybody in connection with this, because these are people that are generally beyond the U.S. Government's reach unless they get lucky and somebody travels to a friendly jurisdiction or to the U.S. itself. And it may have been that they wanted to wrap up some of the forfeiture activities that they were trying to have in place before this went public. But the timing is interesting because obviously with everything we've been talking about with China and the desire to sort of keep up the steady drumbeat of sort of poking China in the eye, this is the timing of this seems very purposeful from that perspective. But I would add two last points, and then I'll put it to Tim. So number one, obviously these Chinese banks are not named. And perhaps that is consistent with what we talked about earlier, which is maybe a desire to, but not the willingness as of yet to really hold those banks to account, to put them on the SDN list, to charge them in a criminal court in the U.S. and really potentially spin up some real chaos if that were to happen. But it is a bit of a shot across the bow because it's, I'm sure, not that difficult for those who are intimately aware of the details to figure out perhaps what banks these are. So that's number one. Number two is there was a relatively, although this did receive a lot of press coverage at the time that it was unsealed, there was no big press release or press conference from DOJ, which is pretty typical in these types of cases because as many have pointed out, the primary purpose often with these is to name and shame the people involved and to make a big public show of this for deterrent effect so that people become, both the people who need to comply with these situations and may be encountering these types of actors are aware of them and can better tune their compliance procedures to deal with that. And also that it just lets everybody involved know, we know what you're up to. We have what we believe to be a chargeable, prosecutable case that we have brought in a U.S. court. And in terms of travel and other activities that are now potentially in jeopardy or off the table for some of these people, that becomes kind of a centerpiece of some of these things. But there was a relatively muted, again, kind of public rollout of this from the DOJ perspective. I don't really have a good explanation for that. I was involved in many of these back in the day, and there was always a huge effort to really make a splashy sort of impact when these things got unveiled, and that didn't really seem to be the case here, although again it was covered pretty extensively in the Washington Post and the New York Times and many of the other outlets that follow this stuff closely. So that's a lot. Those are sort of my laundry list of thoughts on this for the moment, and then I'll kind of turn it to Tim for his reactions as well.
Yeah, I think you've about covered it, Brian, but a couple of key takeaways for me were just a reinforcement of this kind of China-North Korea link and Chinese financial institutions, whether it's through the enforcement policies or through the sanctions authorities generally, if the U.S. chooses to go after Chinese financial institutions, it's going to be a really big fundamental shift in enforcement practice and sanctions practice and could have significant repercussions. And it looked like this indictment was aimed at some Chinese banks here and kind of flagging the link to North Korea is something that it's not new, but it is kind of a big data point in terms of that link and something that companies ought to take into account in terms of another red flag.
I should add quickly too, there could be more coming on that front, definitely, because those banks are not named. Right. They could theoretically be teed up to be added to the SDN list, or right. There could be additional criminal charges coming. Perhaps.
Right. That's just where I was going to go.
Yeah,
is that no. I think that it's good that you jumped in to add that, because I think that basically the fact that those banks aren't named tells me that one of a couple things could be going on. I mean, the first is that, and I've worked on cases like this, I'm sure you have too, Brian, where there is a plan at the time of the indictment to arrest somebody. They have a plan in the works, and it's a relatively concrete plan, and it just doesn't happen. Or if it happens, it doesn't come to fruition because they can't get extradition. They have a plan. They keep the indictment sealed because they're trying to execute that plan, and at some point it becomes clear that that plan's not going to work, and at that point the indictment becomes unsealed. That might explain why they weren't anxious to have a press conference, because if their point here was to actually bring some people into the courts of the United States, and that didn't happen, you would understand why they didn't have a press conference. Although I agree with you that I think that the unsealing probably was more related to the forfeiture proceedings and trying to lock down at least some of the funds. But I also think that, as you said, Brian, that there probably or could be other proceedings going on, either within the courts. It could still be that one or more of these banks are cooperating, and that might have been how they found out about it, and so they're still thinking about what to do about the other banks, either through the criminal justice system or through OFAC. Could be about to go on the SDN list. There could be an enforcement action, because as I understand it, at least some of these transactions involve connections to the US financial system. So if that's the case, then there could be penalties coming, and there could be negotiations going on about a penalty, and so they've decided not to make the names public for that reason. I mean, that at least was allegedly what was happening with Hulk Bank, and ultimately Hulk Bank got indicted in the Zarab Attila proceedings. Ultimately, Hulk Bank is now in front of the court in New York out of those same proceedings, and that could happen here, or at the very least there could be an OFAC action that is going on. But I do think that when you look at it now, things do look a little bit weird, where there's really no one who seems to be the apparent target of this other than just kind of sending a message, and then you don't have a press conference that sends that message.
Yeah. No, agree. So we'll leave it there. We may very well be coming back to that one again in the future. So with that wraps up kind of the main portion of the show, and we have reached everybody's favorite portion, which is the lightning round. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. O'Toole to take us down to Venezuela for the latest happenings down there.
So we can be very quick on this lightning round. Sometimes there's more to say, but here we did want to pause and talk about another designation of 4 vessels. This took place on June 2nd. We're recording on June 5th, so it's only a few days ago. The stated ground for the designation of the vessels is that they were working to assist the Maduro regime. And I think the statement from Secretary Mnuchin was that that the Maduro regime has enlisted the help of maritime companies and their vessels to continue the exploitation of Venezuela's natural resources for the regime's profit. So the allegation was that these vessels, I believe, were carrying oil for the Maduro regime. Now, the designation was not particularly clear about what in particular about these transactions really aided and abetted the Maduro regime. I've heard rumors that they were involved with other illicit activities or other sanctionable activities that the U.S. government has been interested in, and namely the oil for food program, although that's just a rumor I've heard. So it's not in any of the statements, but I do think that, as we go on, when you're looking for a pattern here, the pattern is that the designations take place. There's an announcement that whoever was designated was doing something to help the Maduro regime, but the authorities are often very tight-lipped on exactly what that was, and that is, I guess, a strategy that they're using, but it does make it difficult to advise people as to what it involves illegitimately acting within the Venezuelan oil sector, and what doesn't, because there's certainly participants in the Venezuelan oil sector right now that are not being sanctioned, and so it's very hard to draw the line between the good side of the line and the bad side of the line. You have to do a lot of work behind the scenes in order to do that. So, from our end, it really is it creates problems in line drawing. Maybe from OFAC's perspective, they don't want you to know what the line is so that you don't go anywhere near it.
Yeah, and I'll just add very quickly that I noted that the 4 companies, so 4 companies and 4 vessels were added, and the 4 companies are from, respectively, are from either the Marshall Islands or Greece. And so just for, again, we talked about the Maritime Advisory the last time on the last episode, but just for anybody out there in that space, I think a good reminder, those are obviously 2 big players kind of in the, you know, the maritime industry, many vessels flagged from those locations. Just another kind of reminder in terms of diligence and compliance to be on the lookout for red flags and other things, because you know, obviously here now we have sort of explicit connections with sanctioned conduct in Venezuela, and just sort of more to consider, think about, and be on the lookout for anybody that's doing that kind of vetting. So. And with that, that was truly pretty lightning. That's about as lightning
Pretty fast, right?
as we ever get. So let's stay on the seas. Item number 2 is actually a little bit of an older item. This came up last early in May, and I think it was just we never got to it, in part because of our very China-focused agenda of late. But criminal charges were filed in DC against 2 Iranian nationals relating to sanctions violations and money laundering violations for the purchase of a petroleum tanker. And this is notable. So the underlying facts are basically these 2 individuals working through a front company, or front companies rather, managed to purchase a petroleum tanker from a Liberian company. And there were a couple of payments made. The payments implicated, one of them transited the U.S. Financial system, the initial down payment, and then the second one was sent through the U.S. financial system and was blocked because the bank apparently, the correspondent bank, recognized that there was a problem and a potential connection to Iran, and blocked it. There's also a related forfeiture proceeding to get all of the funds that were involved in the transactions. And so I think in some ways, and the allegation is that the tanker was then, as soon as it was taken possession of, it was quickly deployed for the benefit of the Iranian government, the National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, and that one of the lead defendants in the case has ties to IRGC Quds Force. So that's those are sort of the overarching facts there. I think the quick takeaway here, to harken back to what we just talked about with the North Korea case a few minutes ago, is again just sort of the idea that the touch with the U.S. correspondent bank account, and you know the idea that even when it doesn't appear to sort of my reasonably well-trained eyes that this scheme was sort of all that sophisticated or well thought out, and that the front companies that were put in place and the way these things were set up and routed were not done with sort of the level of sophistication that maybe even in the North Korean case they were. But I think it's just another reminder that you know, from a due diligence perspective and from a red flag perspective, understanding, you know, ultimate beneficial ownership. Apparently there was some concerns and red flags relating to the front company, which, by the way, which is Taif, is the name, TAIF, and they were added to the SDN list in connection with this case as well. There were some concerns that they had no experience and no business buying a tanker like this, and apparently somebody in the chain or related vouched for them. That's what's alleged. So, you know, that's kind of a good example of maybe where somebody was pushing back, and then ultimately they were not, no pun intended, kind of sold a bill of goods as to somebody's credentials, and then things were allowed to go forward when they really probably should have been stopped at that point. So that's really all I have on that one, and I'll flip it to Tim for any quick thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that this is just another example of the importance of due diligence in the shipping industry. And we talked about the maritime advisory recently, and that that OFAC has been really saying that this is a high risk industry, and if you're doing transactions in that industry, you just need to be very, very careful, because if you're not, you can run into problems like the ship sellers ran into in this case.
All right, and with that, I think we're about to wrap up maybe our fastest lightning round ever by heading to our last topic, which is the announcement from May 22nd of a number of entity list additions and the curious delay in actually seeing those additions on the list.
Right. So, as you mentioned, Brian, on May 22nd. So, what is
2 weeks
that?
ago.
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
It's the last time we recorded the podcast. Actually, right after the podcast, or right after we recorded it, BIS announced that it was adding 33 Chinese entities to the entity list. They were doing that because of the links between these entities, what BIS viewed as the links between these entities and the Chinese military. And there was an announcement and then nothing. And normally, the announcement accompanies a Federal Register notice, or if it doesn't accompany it, it's the following day or the following business day. But May 22nd, May 29th comes, a week passes, still no word. This week comes, still no word. And as of the time that we were really putting together the agenda for this, there was still no word. Well, today, the BIS published a notice in the Federal Register with these entities, putting them on the entity
By the way,
list.
I will interrupt you to say that I'm checking right now, and it still does not appear to be up.
No, I've got it in front of me.
Oh, you do have it up. Okay.
Yeah. So I have it in front of me.
Your Googling skills or your
right,
maneuvering of the Federal Register homepage is better than mine.
while recording a podcast on camera. Right. So yes. So it's at 85 FR 34495 is where you can find it. But they have added this to the entity list. We heard word yesterday that they were going to, because there is a service that will give you previews of the Federal Register the day before, and one of the great trade lawyers in Washington, Doug Jacobson, is very, very facile in that list, and so he always has this information before anybody else does. And so
has it up on LinkedIn and Twitter before you can blink, basically.
Exactly.
Shout out to Doug.
Exactly. So if you want to know what's happening, particularly with respect to BIS, Doug always knows before anybody else does, and he did here. So we saw that this was coming last night from Doug's Twitter feed, and it did show up this morning. And so it looks like a general Federal Register notice. There's not that much interesting about it. The effective date is today. So essentially these entity listings have become effective today. And the only other thing that's kind of interesting about it, and the reason that we, having announced that companies were going on the entity list, that creates concern, obviously, if you're trying to send U.S. origin goods to those companies, but they didn't tell anybody what the restrictions were. And so, the entity list varies in terms of what the restrictions are. Sometimes it is only certain items are restricted. Sometimes there's a licensing policy that is a presumption of grant for certain items, case by case for certain items, presumption of denial. And if you don't know what the requirements are in the licensing policy, you're basically stuck. And so for 2 weeks, companies have been stuck in terms of doing business with these entities. And unlike many of the entities on the entity list, some of these companies not only are outside of China, so they're subsidiaries, but they're pretty big. And so this is not like an entity list listing of some like really small minor company that did a few things that the US didn't like and really doesn't do that much business with the US. These are some pretty big companies. And so that was kind of a 2-week period of uncertainty that was pretty unusual. Ultimately, I've looked through the list, and it looks like all of the entities now have a licensing requirement for all items subject to the EAR. So any U.S. origin good, including EAR 99, requires a license now to sell to these companies. And there is a presumption of denial. So it's going to be very hard to get a license. So pretty much these companies are off limits to U.S. origin goods as a practical matter.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly. 33 entities altogether, including so many big companies, as Tim said, some universities and research institutes as well, and put on the list for a variety of reasons. In the press release, it was identified as sort of military and use considerations and concerns, or human rights considerations and concerns tying back to our first topic relating to the Uyghurs and surveillance technology that's used with respect to the Uyghurs and other ethnic and Muslim populations in China. And so I think the interesting question for us coming out of this was, in that 2-week window, and there is, and again, I haven't had a chance to review it, but my understanding is that there's a savings clause in there that basically says anything that's being exported pursuant to either a no license required or a license exception or an existing specific license, if it goes by today, which is the day of the Federal Register notice and the effective date, then it's okay, and you don't need to go to BIS for a new specific license. But after today, everything is covered. That 2-week window where perhaps companies could have been scrambling to get things out the door on the hope that they could do it before the new rules came into play, or as Tim said, you would find yourself essentially paralyzed because you just don't know what the scope of the restrictions are going to be. That presents some really interesting challenges, I presume, and I think if we were in this position, we would have probably taken the position that we would be on the phone calling BIS to try to get some clarity on timing or scope or what our particular situation was, if there was something that we felt our client would be in, able to perfectly legally export before the listing came down or the new restrictions came down. We would try to have that discussion, try to work that out. But it does present an interesting challenge when you're in that limbo period. And the 2 weeks, as Tim said, is a bit unusual. It's usually maybe a few days at most. So 2 weeks is a little unusual, but as we've covered, hopefully with ample detail today in the past few episodes, there's plenty going on to occupy BIS and everybody else in the US government at the moment. So perhaps the explanation is as simple as that. But
well, the one thing that I will say, the other thing that's unusual, I was just looking at this notice because it just came out. At the very end, it looks like Secretary Ross signed it on May 15th. So there was a week delay before they announced it, and then another 2-week delay before they actually released it, which is pretty unusual.
Which perhaps suggests that there could have been, as I am speculating, there could have been some discussions going on about a few shipments, transactions, or other things that they wanted to let essentially clear before this came down. That could very well be the case. Now that's us putting our tinfoil hats on a little bit, but that would not be out of the question if there were a few things where there was a persuasive case made that this should be allowed to go, and maybe that's what happened here. But that is a bit odd that we're looking at 3 weeks of delay from the signing until it sees the light of day. Sometimes there's wrangling behind the scenes for other reasons, but yeah. In any event, that is, I think that's. I'll take my tinfoil hat off now, and
something was
we'll
happening.
leave it at that.
We just don't know what.
We just don't know what. So, I think with that, we are wrapped for this week. And thank you to everybody once again for tuning in, for downloading, for listening. Again, if you enjoyed the pod, please, we encourage you to subscribe, to give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating, and to tell folks about it. We have been getting some feedback from surprising and fun ways through some word of mouth. So that's always something we certainly enjoy. Please feel free to hit us up on LinkedIn, Twitter, or email if you have any comments, thoughts, questions, or anything else that you have about anything we covered or anything you want to see us cover in the future. And I think to harken back to what we started with today, we really do encourage everybody to stay safe out there, no matter what you're doing, whether at home or in the streets, and to, of course, stay sanctions free.
Stay safe, everybody. Thanks for listening, and stay sanctions free.
All right. Thanks. Until next time. Bye.